Welcome to the debate. When a massive steel suspension bridge collapses into the ocean, structural engineers don't just investigate the very last delivery truck that happened to be driving over it at the exact moment it fell.
Right. They look at the steel itself.
Exactly. They look at the microscopic stress fractures that have been forming deep within the metal for decades, fractures that are totally invisible to the naked eye, driven by the sheer environmental hostility of salt water, wind, and corrosive air.
Yeah, the elements wearing it down over time.
Right. But what if the air itself is fundamentally so corrosive that no amount of standard maintenance could save the structure? And, what if the maintenance manuals we are handed actually accelerate the rusting process?
Well, that brings us right to the core of what we're looking at today. We are examining the fault line between two distinct narratives regarding our modern epidemics of addiction, mental illness, and chronic disease.
Are these afflictions primarily the result of unhealed childhood trauma within a fundamentally toxic culture?
Or, on the other hand, are they better understood as matters of human agency, choice, and contextual coping?
This intellectual exchange emerges from the arguments presented by Dr. Gabor Mate in his work, The Myth of Normal.
And we're contrasting his framework with empirical and philosophical critiques from psychologists like Stanton Peele, Nick Haslam, Gene Heyman, and Sally Satel.
I will be arguing that trauma and cultural toxicity are the foundational master keys to understanding our suffering. These are not isolated biological events, but rather profound physiological responses to an unnatural world.
And I will be arguing that human freedom remains primary. While early adversity undeniably influences our vulnerability, framing all intense coping and chronic illness as a trauma pathology severely limits our capacity to heal. I believe that telling people they are permanently wounded by a toxic society actually strips them of the fundamental agency and responsibility they need to change their lives.
Let's jump right into the deep end of this because, the stakes here are life and death for millions of people. When we look around today, we see soaring, unprecedented rates of addiction, depression, and autoimmune diseases.
It's staggering, yeah.
It really is, and my position is that we cannot look at these as individual genetic failures. They are manifestations of a person's relationship to a toxic environment. Drawing on Dr. Mate's framework, the root soil of this suffering is often what we call small t trauma.
Okay, define small t trauma for us.
So I'm not just talking about catastrophic, headline-grabbing events like war or severe physical abuse. I am talking about environments where essential human needs for unconditional love, secure attachment, and emotional freedom are, simply not met.
But not met is doing a lot of heavy lifting there. You're expanding the definition of trauma to encompass almost the entirety of the human experience.
Because the human experience has become alienated from its evolutionary needs. Think about a child whose environment demands that they suppress their authentic self, their anger, their sadness, their exuberance, just to maintain a connection to their caregivers.
Right.
A deep psychological imprint is formed, and here's the crucial mechanism. This suppression of the authentic self isn't just a mental trick, it literally translates into physical and behavioral afflictions.
Wait, literally translates?
Yes. When a child suppresses their authentic emotions to secure attachment, their body stays in a state of chronic, low-grade stress. Their nervous system is constantly pumping cortisol into their bloodstream. Over decades, that constant inflammatory state completely deregulates the immune system, turning it against the body.
I see the physiological logic, but
in this model, an addiction or an autoimmune flare-up is not a failure of morals. It is an attempt to escape from profound internal pain, or the physical result of carrying that pain. It's a completely natural response to a deeply unnatural culture.
I come at it from a very different way. Look, no one here is arguing that early adversity doesn't matter or that chronic stress doesn't have physiological consequences, but the trauma-centric model, as critics like Nick Haslam have pointed out, drastically oversimplifies a vastly complex web of causes.
How so?
It takes one variable childhood emotional distress and turns it into a theory of everything. It's a hammer that sees every human struggle as a trauma nail. The reality is that most people who experience severe, undeniable trauma do not become addicted to substances.
But that ignores the systemic nature of the environment.
Let me finish this thought because this goes to the core of human nature. Human beings are endowed with an irreducible freedom to choose. When we label all maladaptive behaviors as trauma wounds or frame them as symptoms of permanent brain damage caused by a toxic society, we risk profoundly disempowering people.
I don't think it disempowers them at all.
It does. We risk framing them as permanent victims of their past, rather than moral agents capable of taking heroic steps to change their future. If everything is trauma, then nothing is a choice.
I understand the fear of removing agency. I do. But let's look at the culture itself, because you can't exercise agency if you're drowning in poison and don't know it. Dr. Mate uses this brilliant analogy from the laboratory.
The Petri dish analogy, right?
Exactly. If you are a scientist studying microorganisms in a petri dish, and you notice that the organisms in this nutrient broth are dying off in great numbers, or they are failing to thrive, you wouldn't pull out a microscope, look at one specific bacterium and diagnose it with a genetic disorder.
No, you'd look at the environment.
You would look at the broth. You would say, this is a toxic culture. Look at our society right now. 60% of U.S. adults have a chronic disorder. 40% have more than one.
The numbers are definitely alarming.
We have a staggering rise in ADHD, fatal overdoses, and youth depression. The socioeconomic environment we have built under globalized capitalism, which is defined by profound lowliness, economic uncertainty, and a total loss of community, is fundamentally at odds with human evolutionary needs.
I like the Petri dish analogy, but let's actually play it out. If the entire culture is, as you say, a universally toxic broth, then why do individuals in the exact same dish exhibit such widely different outcomes?
Well, genetics play a role in susceptibility.
But think about it. You can have two siblings who grow up in the exact same household, exposed to the exact same economic stress and the exact same parenting style. One develops a severe substance use disorder and the other becomes a marathon runner, or leans deeply into their faith, or builds a thriving family.
Right, but
If the environment dictates the pathology, the outcomes should be far more uniform. I have to push back hard on this idea of pathogenic determinism. It's not determinism, though. It's susceptibility. To prove this isn't just a generic human condition, look at the indigenous populations in Canada. Prior to colonization and the horrific systematic trauma of the residential school system, where children were ripped from their families and stripped of their identity, autoimmune disease was essentially non-existent in those populations. Non-existent.
Practically, yes. But today, an indigenous Canadian woman has 6 times the rate of rheumatoid arthritis compared to the general population. That is a direct, physical, measurable manifestation of historical and cultural wounding. The trauma physically alters the baseline of the nervous system across generations.
And I don't dispute the devastating impact of historical atrocities like the residential school system. That is capital T trauma. But what Mate's expanded definition of small t trauma actually does is conflate that horrific systemic abuse with everyday adversity.
it's not conflating, it's showing the mechanism is the same.
It pathologizes normal human distress. By saying that merely having unmet needs constitutes trauma, we dilute the clinical utility of the word. Life is inherently stressful. Conflict, grief, and unmet needs are universal features of the human condition, not modern capitalist anomalies.
But the baseline has shifted.
When we frame ordinary adversity as a trauma wound, we are telling people that their normal emotional growing pains are actually deep-seated psychological injuries that require forensic excavation to fix.
I see why you think that, but let me challenge your definition of ordinary adversity, because I think you are severely underestimating how unnatural our baseline has become. Our society actively trains parents to ignore their most basic evolutionary instincts.
How so?
Take a mother gorilla. You would never tell a mother gorilla in the wild to ignore her crying baby. It goes against every biological imperative, right?
Sure, of course.
Yet, we have an entire industry of modern parenting experts telling human parents to let their infants cry it out for the sake of parental convenience. Or, to give toddlers timeouts for exhibiting completely natural anger.
Wait, stop right there. If I'm a parent listening to this right now, I am probably panicking.
I mean, it's a hard reality to face.
Are you seriously suggesting that putting a misbehaving toddler in a timeout is the root cause of the modern autoimmune and opioid epidemics? Because that feels like a massive, frankly, guilt-inducing leap. We have to be incredibly careful not to pathologize normal parenting boundaries.
I am not saying a single Tuesday afternoon where a parent loses their patience causes a lifelong disease. I am talking about a systemic, repeated pattern where a child learns that their negative emotions are unacceptable.
Okay, but how does a timeout lead to chronic illness?
When a 2-year-old is banished to their room in a timeout because they are angry, their primitive nervous system perceives a threat to survival. They need attachment to their caregiver to live. So to keep the parent's love, the child suppresses the anger.
They're just learning behavioral regulation.
No, we communicate that love is conditional on their compliance. This forces a developing human to choose between attachment, which they need to survive, and authenticity, which they need to be whole. That is not normal emotional growing pain. That is a forced severing of the self.
A severing of the self? That's very dramatic.
And physiologically, that repressed emotion keeps the nervous system on high alert for decades. That creates the precise unconscious imprint that later drives chronic stress, inflammation, and the desperate need to numb out with substances.
I understand the physiological theory of chronic stress, but I just don't buy that standard behavioral boundaries create a severing of the self that inevitably leads to addiction. Let's shift the focus to the actual mechanics of severe coping mechanisms, specifically addiction, because I think history gives us a very different lens.
Okay, let's look at history.
Let's look at the classic example of American and British soldiers during World War II. These young men were thrust into literal hell. They faced horrific stress, the constant threat of death, watching their friends die, and profound moral injury.
Right.
At the front lines, they drank heavily. Some used whatever narcotics they could find. It was a normative, contextual coping strategy for an unbearable situation.
Exactly. They were in profound pain.
Yes, but watch what happened next. When the war ended, the vast majority of those men returned home to their families, re-entered the workforce, and stopped drinking destructively.
Because the trauma of the war was over.
They didn't need years of trauma therapy to uncover their authentic selves or process their inner child. They just needed a change in incentives and environment. This perfectly aligns with Harvard psychologist Gene Heyman's view of addiction as a disorder of choice.
A disorder of choice?
Yes. People respond to incentives. When the wartime context was removed and the incentives of peace, family, and employment were introduced, the heavy drinking stopped. If addiction were a permanent disease of trauma wounding, an indelible scar on the nervous system, those men would have been addicts for life regardless of their environment.
That is a beautifully articulated example, but I am going to hijack that exact same historical reality to make the exact opposite point.
Oh, really? Go for it.
Those WADY soldiers were profoundly traumatized, and they drank to numb the excruciating physiological and emotional pain of that trauma while they were in it. The fundamental difference between them and us is that when they came home, the war was over.
Right.
They returned to a society that at the time still had high degrees of social cohesion, clear purpose, and community support. The tragedy of modern life is that for millions of people today, the war is entirely invisible, and it never ends.
The invisible war of modern life?
Yes. It is the systemic loneliness of a society where the extended family has been obliterated. It is the chronic, grinding insecurity of living paycheck to paycheck with no safety net. People today are drinking or using fentanyl or doom scrolling for 10 hours a day for the exact same reason those soldiers drank in the trenches.
To escape the suffering?
Exactly. To escape intolerable suffering. This is why Dr. Mate argues we must completely reject the label of addict. When someone stands up in a circle and says, "I am an addict," they are falsely separating the person from the internal process.
How so?
They are turning a verb into a noun. They are turning a temporary coping mechanism into a permanent identity. The person is not an addict. They are simply a human being in deep pain trying to soothe an unbearable internal state.
That is a beautifully poetic framing. Turning a verb into a noun, I'll give you that. It sounds incredibly empathetic. But practically, it ignores decades of longitudinal data on how human beings actually change their behavior.
The data doesn't contradict the trauma.
Avoiding terms like addiction and recovery and demanding that everyone embark on this lifelong quasi-spiritual search for their authentic self ignores the reality that people frequently mature out of heavy substance use simply because their life roles change.
Maturing out is just
They get married, they have children, they get a job they care about, and suddenly the hangover isn't worth it anymore. These external choices and commitments shift behavior far more reliably and often far faster than digging up childhood pain to find an unresolved wound.
But if the wound is driving the behavior, external changes are just putting a fresh coat of paint over rotting wood.
I disagree. When you tell a 30-year-old that their heavy drinking is an inevitable downstream consequence of their mother not validating their anger when they were 3, you are giving them an alibi.
An alibi?
Yes, you are shifting the locus of control away from the present moment where they actually have power and placing it in the unchangeable past. Choices, habits, and commitments are the engines of change, not an endless archaeological dig into the psyche.
You use the word alibi as if acknowledging trauma is a way to avoid taking responsibility. That is a massive misconception of the trauma model. Trauma awareness does not equal victimhood.
It certainly leans that way in practice.
Not at all. In fact, true agency, the very freedom you are so fiercely championing, absolutely requires looking fearlessly at the wound. You cannot exercise agency over a physiological process that you are entirely blind to. Dr. Mate uses the concept of disease as a teacher. Consider a woman he writes about named Mio Lee, who suffered from scleroderma.
Right, the autoimmune condition.
Yes, and for listeners who don't know, it is a terrifying disease where your connective tissues harden. Your body literally attacks itself, thickening your skin and internal organs. Mia Lee described it as being mummified alive.
It's horrific.
It really is, and standard medical interventions completely failed her. But here is the profound part. She didn't heal by simply changing her external habits or responding to present incentives. She healed by realizing her entire life had been spent as a chronic people pleaser, constantly suppressing her healthy anger to keep other people comfortable.
And you're saying that caused her disease?
The stress of that suppression was keeping her immune system in a hyperactive, self-destructive loop. By reclaiming her authenticity, setting fierce boundaries, and refusing to suppress her emotions, her nervous system finally regulated. Her disease went into remission. The unhealed imprint overrides logical choices.
Let me jump in here, because this specific point is where the trauma model becomes incredibly dangerous.
Dangerous.
Yes, if disease is a teacher and healing requires finding your authentic self and resolving your childhood trauma, what do we say to the person who dies of cancer? What do we say to the person whose scleroderma doesn't go into remission?
That's not the implication.
Do we tell them they just didn't self-actualize hard enough, that they failed to uncover their trauma? That is an incredibly cruel burden to place on a sick person.
That is a complete mischaracterization of the model. It's not about blame. It's about understanding the mind-body connection. It's acknowledging that our biography becomes our biology. Let me give you another example of how deeply these imprints bypass our conscious choice.
Okay.
Mate shares a story of arriving at the airport at age 72. He's a highly successful, world-renowned doctor. He lands, and his wife isn't there to pick him up. She's running late. Instead of logically saying, "Oh, traffic must be bad," he flies into a dark, withdrawing, devastating rage.
Over a late ride?
Exactly. Why? What is the mechanism there? In that moment, the midfrontal cortex, the logical, rational, adult decision-making part of his brain, completely shuts down. It goes offline. The trauma takes over.
A trauma response.
Right. For Mate, his unconscious brain flashed back to being a 1-year-old infant in wartime Hungary, where his mother handed him to a stranger to save his life from the Nazis. The 72-year-old disappeared, and the terrified, abandoned 1-year-old took the wheel. You cannot simply choose your way out of a trigger like that if you haven't acknowledged it exists. The biology overrides the philosophy.
I don't discount that self-awareness is valuable. Understanding your triggers, especially profound historical trauma like surviving the Holocaust, is obviously helpful. But I insist, alongside scholars like Sally Satel, that addiction and maladaptive behaviors in the modern day are deeply entrenched habits.
Habits driven by pain.
They are learned behaviors, and they can be unlearned. Healing does not always require a forensic excavation of the past to find an emotional root cause. What Stanton Peele warns us about is the danger of learned helplessness.
But it's not helpless.
If you tell someone, Your brain is rewired by a toxic culture and early developmental trauma, and your addiction or your anxiety is just a biological symptom of that. You might think you're giving them compassion, but you are actively stripping them of the moral agency required to take the difficult, heroic steps toward change.
I hear your concern about helplessness. Truly, I do. But your argument implies that the trauma model tells people they are permanently broken. It doesn't. It tells them they are injured, and injuries can heal.
But focusing constantly on the injury.
If you don't recognize that the trauma is an internal physiological wound, you will spend your whole life fighting the behavioral symptoms while the infection rages on underneath. The disconnection from our true selves, driven by an unnatural, hyper-individualistic culture and early developmental trauma, is the root soil of our modern epidemics.
I just don't think it's the only soil.
Whether it is an autoimmune disease flaring up from decades of repressed anger, or an addiction serving as a chemical anesthetic against the unbearable pain of loneliness, the mechanism is the same. Recognizing this wound, rather than just trying to behaviorally manage it with new habits, is the most profound way to actually reclaim authentic agency. It is the only path to true wholeness. We have to stop swimming in this toxic water and pretending that the solution is just to swim harder.
And my perspective is that while past pain, cultural pressures, and physiological stress are undeniably real and deeply difficult to navigate, human freedom is an irreducible reality of the human condition. We are not just biological machines responding to cultural inputs and childhood programming.
Nobody's saying we're just machines.
Emphasizing that every intense coping mechanism or emotional struggle is a deep, permanent trauma, risk-stripping individuals of the exact tool they need to survive their immediate, empowering capacity to choose their response to the present. You don't have to perfectly fix your childhood to change your life today.
No, you don't have to be perfect, but
You can build new habits, assume new responsibilities, change your environment, and find profound meaning in the present moment. Agency is a muscle, and if we tell people it's broken, they will stop using it.
what is clear from this exchange is that both of our perspectives completely converge on the absolute necessity of deep compassion for human suffering. Whether someone's pain manifests as an addiction, a mental health crisis, or a chronic physical illness, the suffering is real, the pain is valid, and the need for a humane, dignified response is paramount.
Absolutely. Compassion is the non-negotiable starting point for any of this. From there, we leave it to the listener to decide whether they will view their own struggles primarily through the lens of profound historical wounds that must be uncovered and healed to find peace, or through the immediate, empowering capacity to step up, look at their present incentives, and choose their response to the moment. There is a vast wealth of literature on human resilience, habit formation, and trauma recovery still to explore.
Indeed, there is. And as we leave you today, I want you to think back to that massive steel bridge suspended over the ocean. When you feel the structure of your own life shaking under the weight of the world, do you need to look closer at the daily traffic driving over the surface to manage the load, or is it time to finally examine the invisible fractures deep within the steel?